would you like to follow Aldo Leopold? Well, it's good to be back in Wisconsin. Yesterday when I pulled down my little yellow pad and started scratching some notes from today, out fell a couple of pages that I had written 3 weeks ago for a meeting up in Stevens Point of your Conservation Hall of Fame, where we inducted Nina Leopold Bradley. And the family asked me to come and say a few words. Over the years, I've gotten to know the Leopold family very well, and it's quite an honor to do so. But it's good to be back here again today and to share ideas with each other. In my work in the Iowa legislature, I recall most of us didn't have any really new ideas, but we looked at states around us and we looked at other places, other countries, and we said, you know, they've got a pretty good idea there. And one of the places we often looked to was Wisconsin. I recall in our Groundwater Protection Act, we were doing some work on solid waste. And you had this innovative idea of putting 15 cents a ton on garbage that you then used for recycling programs. And so we slipped into our Groundwater Protection Act Wisconsin's idea, except we started at 25 cents and we're now at about $5. So, but one of the neat things I think about when I think about our system and our different levels of government and different states and so on is the ability to look across borders and to look at different ideas from other states and what's going on, and used to be tried to one-up each other. Now it seems like we're trying to drive each other to the lowest common denominator. And we got to be careful not to let that happen. Our daughter lives in Sweden, and Sweden is part of a group of Nordic countries. And instead of laws there that say you can't be any more strict than what the federal government says or what the state says at the local level, the Nordic countries say we can't be any less strict than the strictest. So they look at Iceland, or they look at Finland, or Sweden will look at Denmark or Norway. They've passed a law that tightened up some regulations on something, on the environment. And Sweden immediately says, we're not going to let them be better than us. So their stringency clauses, rather than driving you to the lowest common denominator, elevate everybody as they go along. And I'm not one to stand up here and say we need a whole lot more regulations, but we do need to look at ways in which we can do things better than what we are. And that's what a conference like this is all about. Another example, we looked across at Wisconsin 3 nights ago in our county planning and zoning meeting and saw the troubles you were having with frac sand mining and said, we don't want to be like Wisconsin. And we passed a 1.5-year moratorium in our county on mining. And we did that because we feel that there are a lot of good ideas coming together now. And it may not be that we will never allow it, but we'll do our best to do it right and share with other states and other counties around to see whether or not we can't come up with good ideas. 3 weeks ago, when I came back from Stevens Point to our home in Decorah, I stopped through the wildlife refuge here, Necetas, although I was over on the other side on some state land, and took my binocs and walked one of the levees over there. And just across the pond was a pair of whooping cranes. We talked today about Leopold coming back and seeing sandhill cranes in this scenario. And for us to see whooping cranes in the wild, and not just down in Aransas in the wintertime when they all congregate, but to see a pair of them in the wild in Wisconsin was pretty amazing. I went back and looked at my bird book when I got back in the car and looked up whooping crane, and it said, this was a 1960s book, so it was getting a little old, but it said there are 50 left in the wild. Well, guess what? They're more than 50 today. We still have a long way to go. But what it says too is that, we can get down in the dumps and we can say that things are not good. But there are a lot of things that are good too, and we need to remember some of those as we move along. Some things are better than they were when Aldo Leopold was here. And partly because of people like you and people like Aldo Leopold, understanding land and working hard to do better. Wanted to mention just briefly a personal statement. I'm not like our president. I can't bounce up onto the stage anymore. Like if I were him, I'd run up on the stage and jump right in and talk. But about a year ago, the tractor got the best of me, and I was thrown from my tractor and broke my neck and my hip and a few other things. And when I woke up in that field, in an alfalfa field, I shouted for help, and a neighbor farmer heard me and came over and lay down next to me in the field. And we talked. And I'll never forget that conversation. It wasn't planned, but he lay down there and we talked about life because I didn't think I was going to make it. And what we talked about was the beauty of that day. Here I was lying in this alfalfa field, not knowing how bad I was hurt, but knowing that it wasn't good. And we talked about the trees on our farm that we had planted, and I could lie there and look at them across the fields and just look at the landscape and the beauty of the place that we live. And it was a strange conversation, wasn't it? But we talked about our children and our grandchildren and my wife, and for Dave to tell them that I love them. But what I really remember is opening my eyes and seeing the beauty of the land around us. And I have a very religious brother-in-law. His first question was, "Did you see that bright light at the end of the tunnel?" And I had to confess that apparently it wasn't my time yet and I didn't see it. But I did see the bright light all around me. And it made me think, and I've thought a lot since then, of the beauty of the land and our need to really understand it and to appreciate it more than what we do. We just go along. I grew up in a church where we sang these gospel songs, and one of them was, "I love to tell the story because I know it's true. It satisfies my longing as nothing else can do." And we all live with these stories. And there are religions, and I don't want to get into an argument on those right now, but there's also the story of the larger community that we all belong to. And I think that that's one thing that seems to be missing. As we talk about immigration today, we're talking about, those people and those people. And really, the community is much, much larger, isn't it? The community is those two sandhill cranes that flew over here this morning when I was sitting out there. And the community is the wildflowers that we see. And it's springtime, and I just am amazed at the birds that are coming through and in their beautiful spring colors, the orioles and the grosbeaks and the white-throated sparrows and the bluebirds. And it's really something, isn't it, this world that we live in? It's a real treasure. It's something that, don't ever forget that. And when we get angry and we say that, things are not good, stop and look at these things and be refreshed again, thinking that these things are really something worth working for. While I was recovering in a hospital bed in Decorah, my son came in and said, "Tonight, Wendell Berry is going to give the annual speech at the National Endowment for the Humanities." And Washington, D.C. Would you like to listen to it? So he brought in his laptop and we streamed it. And Wendell Berry talked about the need for a land ethic, but also the need for cultivating affection for land, a love of land. And Leopold Rodin talked about this a lot as well, didn't he? You respect something that you know and that you love. He'd write, learn to read the land. And when you do, I have no fear of what it will do to you, or you will do to it, and I know of many good things that it will do to you. The being part of the larger community that we're sharing with all life on this earth is something that I think is extremely important. And before we start talking about water even, we need to understand that this is a larger community and there's a lot more to it. As we expand and we think about community, one of the best ways to look at it is through watersheds, and that's been a real focus, hasn't it, in the last few years, and the fact that our home address is sometimes a watershed. You in Wisconsin are real experts at that. The very first watershed project in the world, probably, certainly in our country, was right over here in Coon Valley, Wisconsin in 1933. And a brand new service had gotten started. It was called the Soil Erosion Service at the time, led by a guy by the name of Hugh Hammond Bennett. How many of you have ever heard of Hugh Hammond Bennett? This is terrible. You're all good conservationists. There's probably no person that has been more influential in conservation in our country. Well, I shouldn't say that, Aldo Leopold, of course. But Hugh Hammond Bennett single-handedly established the soil efforts in our country, the Soil Erosion Service in 1933. In 1935, the Soil Conservation Service, now called the Natural Resources Conservation Service. We used to be the SCS, the Secret Conservation Service. We're now NRCS, the Nationally Recognized Conservation Service. But anyway, Hugh Hammond Bennett started this and went to Congress and got some money and said, we need to do a few watershed projects around the country to see what, at that time we didn't even have the science of what we could do to protect soil and protect wild things and so on. And he got some money, and Aldo Leopold, who was at the University of Wisconsin right about then, or was at the, I think he was at the university by then, said that, you know, we got a perfect place to do one here, and it's out in Coon Valley, Wisconsin. And it's an area in the driftless area, limestone. Within the first 80 years or so of settlement of that, were really destroying the land. Gullies were starting to divide every field into smaller and smaller pieces. And it wouldn't be long before we wouldn't be farming the land at all anymore. And Leopold suggested that we start the project there. Well, the soil conservation idea was that conservation on agriculture was reducing soil loss, increasing resistance to soil erosion. So the idea was, let's go into that watershed and show farmers how to do that. Leopold's idea was, no, it needs to be a lot more than that. The community is much larger, and that we really need to look at water, and we need to look at wildlife, and we need to look at the scenic beauty of the land. We need to look at songbirds. We need to look at whatever that landowner thinks is important, and we need to put all these things together. So the very first watershed in our country project was really laid out with the help of Aldo Leopold and Hugh Hammond Bennett. And they worked with over 400 farmers. And you could go to Coon Valley today and you can see the trees that were planted and the movement of fields from off the steep slopes and the restoration of land there. And by the first 80 years, they found bridges that were 40 or 50 feet down under the sediment in the valleys. And today, the bridges that went in the 30s are still above ground. And so we've had tremendous success in that area. And it's partly because of this understanding that there's more to land than just soil. And we started that project. Well, unfortunately, over the years in the soil conservation work, we've kind of fallen back to the idea of let's just deal with soil erosion. from about the 1980s, we've come back and we brought Leopold back into the movement. And today, depending on where you are, we're working more and more with private landowners on things that go way beyond just soil erosion, although that's certainly one part of it. One of the things we need to understand in an agriculture community is you can't have good water if you don't take good care of soil. My state of Iowa has 36 million acres. About 28 million are in row crops. And as you drive across that, you look and you see cornfields or you see soybean fields. What you should be looking at is a gigantic filter and buffer of water. Every year, every square foot of that land gets almost a meter of water. And if that land is not farmed appropriately, if our activities in that community are not paying attention to that, we will not have good water. You cannot have good water if you don't have good soil quality and if you don't integrate all of these ideas together. And so as we move forward, I think we need to go back and take a look at what we did back in the 1930s, right here in Wisconsin, and share it around the world. So I think, first of all, for all of us to cultivate an appreciation and an affection for the land in the larger sense is important. I think we need to expand the definition of community to go well beyond just whether we and the Mexicans can live together or something, but rather it must be much broader, and it must be putting us as a member of the larger community that Leopold talked about. And then I think in closing, we need to move a little bit further into water and the specifics of it. That's what our speakers will do the rest of the day, I'm sure. But I think we should approach it with the Farm Bureau used to call good science and common sense. Let's take that seriously, shall we? Let's take a look at what we're doing, and is this really good science when we put a huge amount of manure on very sandy soil and then irrigate it or something like that? I mean, you can go down the list of things, and I'm not here to judge one or the other today, but I'm asking you to start thinking in terms of what is good science and what is common sense. If you look at our problems around the nation today in agriculture, many of them are because we did not ask that question. Or if we did, we tried to limit it only to one little piece of it and not the larger community that we're talking about. So I think it's extremely important that we do that. As we expand our community and understand the world better, the questions of good science and common sense are really what we have to focus on, I believe. And then I'll close. I know that we're ready for lunch or moving on, but back in the 1940s, I think, an author that I've always liked a lot, Loren Eiseley. Some of you have read some of his work, maybe. He wrote a book called The Immense Journey, in which he tried to put himself and us into this long journey that we've been on this earth. He was an anthropologist, but he grew up out in Nebraska, and he writes in one of the chapters in that book about going out on the Platte River on a hot summer day. And if you know the Platte River, the idea is it's an inch deep and a mile wide. I mean, it just has little strings of water going everywhere. Of course, it could be a massive flood in the spring with the water coming out of the mountains, but he was out there on this hot day. He talks about taking off his clothes out there amongst some willows and lying on his back and floating on that river and becoming water, essentially, or becoming one with water. And he writes beautifully about, as I recall, about becoming one with the Arctic ice fields and becoming one with the tropical forests and just being connected completely, because water does this, doesn't it? And that is just almost an out-of-body experience there. But he also talked about being part of this long, immense journey that we've been on, because water, so it would take him back into our history and the history of our earth. well, they lay in that water and floated down that stream. And then he went on to talk about the fact that this also is connecting us right here and now with the future. And what is it going to be? And I think that idea of going out and being connected in a river or somewhere with everything worldwide, it's not just our own watershed, but how we're connected worldwide is what's really important. And as we go forward through the day today, I think it's important that we share with each other ideas on how to make things better. But don't forget that we need to continue to cultivate our affection and our love for land. Leopold wrote an essay about Coon Valley a few years after he took part in that project. And he said that there were all these good things going on, and it was really exciting to be part of this. But was probably even more important was in the evening when all the people working on these projects got together. And I think I've been to the bar that he went to in Coon Valley. You should go and check it out. You'll see his spirit there. But he said economists were together with foresters and with soil conservationists. And all of these disciplines came together and talked about how together we can bring all of our science and all of our good knowledge, all of our social science together to make this a healthy watershed. And that's really what we're about, isn't it? And that's what this meeting is about today. And as you go forward and share these ideas, take them back to your communities. And just like Aldo Leopold, hopefully you can come back 50 years from now and walk around and say, there are cranes out there now and they weren't there before. And we can say, the water is better today than it was when we were here. That's our challenge, and I wish you well in working on it. Thanks.